All right, so here's the data from the helpful content update. We monitor a lot of websites. We have tons of data coming in, 100,000 data points. We're monitoring thousands of keywords. This is what we have seen before and after the helpful content update. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that correlation does not equal causation. And also, the next thing I want to point out is that these are not necessarily ranking factors per se, but they do give us an idea of what's happening on the web. So for instance, word count is not going to be a ranking factor. Google doesn't look at your page and say, oh, you have 2,000 words, therefore you're not going to rank. No, but what it can do is give us an idea of what type of content is surfacing, longer form, shorter form, where the web is headed. And that's why for the word count specifically, we notice a 3.26 reduction in average word count, which I think is a little unusual because usually this number has been fairly stable throughout update after update after update. What this indicates is that there's, on average, there's just a bit more short form content ranking in search engine results rather than the long form that we're used to seeing. Next, we have average H2 sub headlines. So how many H2 sub headlines are going to be on results on page 1 of Google, and this actually increased by 4%. I think this is kind of unusual as well because the word count decreased, but the amount of H2s increased. Now, usually the word count and subheadline count is kind of, it stays the same. So this is weird because we have less words, but more H2s. All right. Next, we have average H3 subheadlines. So this I also thought was quite interesting because it decreased by nearly 10%, which is a substantial drop. I mean, it decreased quite a bit. And if anything, right now we're just kind of brainstorming. It appears as if larger cover everything articles are being replaced with more narrowly focused articles that don't necessarily go such into depth into subtopics. So we have slightly shorter articles, and those articles don't have as many H3 subheadlines, which usually you find H3 subheadlines on articles that really go into depth into the topic. Next, we look at H4 subheadlines, and that was also interesting, where that diminished also as well by 10.5%, which really kind of indicates if you take H3s and H4s, articles, big articles with H3s and H4s just seem to not be as prominent as they were before, which might give us some clues. So that's just the data so far. We have average images. Now, average images, this one caught me by surprise. I actually thought that average images would increase because, helpful content update, they're talking about you want to have original photography, original images. I thought this number was going to go way up, and instead it actually went down. So it went down by 15%. And I'm guessing that this is because we once again have potentially less full length, longer, cover everything articles ranking in the search engines. And some articles are actually ranking right now with no images whatsoever. So that was really kind of an interesting figure to me. And that will play on later on in our analysis. Now, moving on, we have relevance score. So relevance score is essentially a measure of traditional SEO. We're using the onpage.ai relevance score. And it measures, it's an algorithm that measures essentially your score, how relevant you are for the query. And it's based around the search term, related entities, the word count, and entity density. So you put all these things combined, you see how many times you use a word. Essentially, you could think of it about like how well is it optimized in a traditional SEO sense. And this actually decreased by 1.2%, which isn't that much, but it does mean that Google is favoring slightly less SEO optimized, at least from a traditional point of view, pages, right? So pages that don't necessarily have as much traditional SEO optimization, this is what we're seeing. Now, on the flip side, and this is kind of interesting because I thought once again, these two should be correlated. While the overall entity count decreased because the word count decreased, the entity density actually increased by 1.9%. So even though we're getting shorter content, because we're getting shorter content, usually you would have less. You're going to have less entities on the page, but the entity density, so how many related entities you're finding in a specific piece of text, actually increased. And this indicates to me that Google's algorithm still reads, understands, and seeks out content with high amount of related entities, regardless of length. So if you have, 300 words, but you have a whole bunch of entities that are kind of like stuffed together or very close proximity, that's going to play a role. You're going to have a very high entity density as opposed to an article with, let's say, 2,000 words, but you have more entities overall, but they're spaced out in a more natural way. You're going to have a lower entity density at that point. So we're going to dive into examples of what this means. But essentially, the data highlights is that word count decreased by about 3%. Subheadlines increased by 4%. We have H3 and H4 subheadlines that decreased about 10% each. Images decreased by 13%. Relevance score decreased by 1.2%. And related entity density increased by 1.9%. Now, all of this stuff, if I had to guess, it actually appears as if larger pages with detailed information, so big articles with H3s, H4s, multiple images, have seen a slight reduction in visibility as opposed to before when they were ranking for quite a lot of things. So related entity density remains the same. If at all, it increased just a bit. So now let's go through some sites. I want to give you some observations and potential clues as to what Google's helpful content update might be looking for.